So now we're very lucky to have Estelle Weyl. She's the open web and performance evangelist for Instart Logic. They help deliver your sites really, really fast. Now, Estelle's been working with the web and making it a better platform, quite honestly, for far longer than the majority of us. She's seriously experienced and really knows her stuff. She's pretty much legendary, and you're going to really enjoy her talk. Fast, simple, and accessible with Estelle.
I'm like, where's my mic? It's on my face. Okay. So my name's, we're going to talk about simple, accessible, and fast websites. The new subtitle of this talk is You Don't Need a Framework for That. So my name is Estelle Weyl. The reason I speak at conferences is not for the fame, but it is for the Twitter followers. I am a Twitter whore. And I am at Estelle VW. And if you have insomnia, I write books. I have a book on Flexbox coming out in a few weeks. That should put you out cold really fast. And I'm writing a book on progressive web apps. So I'm updating mobile HTML5. If you want to learn how to do progressive web apps the old-fashioned way, that book, that's what it's about. But there's the new book on the new way of doing it is coming out. I work at a company called Instart Logic. And if you decide not to follow what I talk about today, as in you decide not to follow performance stuff, we can help you make your website fast. If you actually, we have a really bad marketing department, and their slogan is, I can't even remember it. It's Instart Logic, the world's first endpoint-aware application delivery solution. So I decided to come up with my own slogan, which is, we're fast as fuck. So enough about that. Let me tell you about my first framework. I wrote my first framework when, is your name Max? Was 4. And what this website does, or this page, it was for the old Ophoto. It was their marketing page. And it's tableless, which is not that exciting now, but that was exciting back in 2003. And my framework looked like this. It said, does this browser support getElement by ID? Yeah. So I had to figure out if this site could support DHTML, which was basically JavaScript, whether it supported document getElement by ID, document all, or document layers. That was when you were browser sniffing basically between IE3 and Netscape 6, IE3 being the oldest browser around, Netscape 6 being the newest. Those are not the frameworks that you guys remember. You are lucky you never, it actually wasn't that long. It was actually a very short framework, right? Not bad. Over 1400 baud modem though, that might have been a little bit slow. The reason that you probably started using frameworks was for things like add event listener versus attach event. Now we don't really need the frameworks that we were using before because browsers understand pretty much everything. Add event listener, which is the correct way of doing it instead of attach event, has been supported since IE9. Does anyone here still support IE8 for work? Anyone here hiring? We have someone looking for a job over there, and someone's hiring over here. So you two need to talk. We have getElement by class name, so that's one of the things that people will use jQuery for. The selectors API of query selector and query selector all. You don't need jQuery or any framework for that. It is supported since IE8. Class list, I don't understand why IE9 couldn't support class list, but the get attribute has been working since I was using it in my original framework. So it's been supported, so you can, instead of doing class list, you can just get attribute class. It works on every single. So we're using frameworks to even things out when we have browsers that support everything we need. Now, I'm not saying don't use frameworks. Frameworks are really good. They enable you to write faster and optimize code. You have 4,000 brains, because people are doing pull requests, finding bugs and stuff like that. It's definitely, you don't want to write your own. If you need a framework, use a framework. It allows for function chaining and implicit iteration behavior, which we'll eventually have. It allows less code, and you can code faster. But I don't ever want to see anyone in this room do something like this, and I have seen this in code, which is, let's import a library, and the only thing we're doing with that framework is we are finding the first element and attaching a class to it. Right? Everyone knows how to do this in CSS. I don't even need to show a slide, because I didn't even include a slide on that, because it's too basic. So the way I view frameworks, because I do use them, is I view them as a scaffolding. When I'm prototyping and I want to get the site done in a day and a half to see, will this work? What's the UI? I will put whatever I need in. Weight it down, I don't care. That is throw out code. It's not even refactor code, it's throw out code. You might not throw out your code like I throw out my code, but I do view it as scaffolding. I would never launch a bridge with a scaffold still attached. I would never launch a website with, jQuery, React, Backbone, and a bunch of other dependencies just because I pulled them in to do a quick widget. One of the problems I see with frameworks, or the downsides, is that people aren't learning the basics. We have people who have been doing web development for 2 or 3 years, and they don't know what the name attribute does on an input type, on an input element, rather. So they don't know what a radio button does, that you need a name so that all of your radio buttons are in one group. Senior software engineer I was working with, 3 years of experience, did not know that. And he was a really bright guy, but he had never learned the basics. So the downsides of doing plug-and-play development is people aren't necessarily learning the fundamentals. They're not learning about accessibility or the need for it. They're not learning the CSS fundamentals. They're bloating up their websites, and they're basically, I view it as lazy. Now, I am incredibly lazy. I think being lazy is an awesome feature of an engineer, because you want to do something as simply as possible. But we are called engineers because we also do it smartly. So let's learn today how to do it smartly. So when it comes to not learning everything there is to know about HTML, these are the HTML input elements and their attributes. Attributes, the value for the input type, and then the attributes that go along with that. You'll notice that this screen is pretty much green. There are 2 red marks because date time was removed from the spec, and multiple sliders on range type has not yet been supported. I don't know if it ever will, hopefully one day, but everything else is pretty much green. That means you can use the month input type and every single other input type. But if you're not learning the basics of HTML and the attributes, you're not learning about the pattern attribute, which is awesomely powerful and provides for native validation. And if you are supporting IE8, I'm sorry, over there, and IE9, and even IE10, you still get the text input type if it's not supported. All browsers don't support all of them, but you still get an input, so you can still, submit a value. And that browser understands get attribute, so you can still get the attributes. So Russ, this was posted just 2 days ago in one of his talks, but I think his talk was from a while ago. It says, many developers who have grown up using only frameworks have a total lack of understanding about the fundamentals of HTML. That I already said. This is of great concern, as semantic markup is one of the core principles of the accessible web. For accessibility, you don't need to learn ARIA. ARIA is when you fail at accessibility. If you are using semantic markup and using the correct elements for what you're doing, you have like 80% of the stuff you need covered, if not 90. So this is what a website looks like to a visually impaired person using assistive technology if you don't write your content correctly. When you write learn more or click here, and those are the words that you are highlighting as your link, that is what is read to them. Click here, click here, click here. Don't do that. If you don't put words, captions under your videos, this is what it sounds like. Who here can read his lips? I think even if someone knew how to read lips, one, I don't know what language is speaking, but I've never seen anyone's mouth move that fast when they're speaking. So that is what it sounds like when you are deaf and they don't have captions, but it also sounds like what it does right now when we don't have any audio plugged in. We are all temporarily hearing impaired when it comes to this video. Now, I don't know how to use Photoshop, and this was my attempt at doing color blindness and cognitive disabilities in one slide. It doesn't work. But if you're colorblind and can't see the difference between red and green, that's an issue. If you have low vision, you need the aspect ratio, the difference of ratios. You need to have good contrast, basically. And if you have cognitive disabilities, the click here might not make sense to you. And reading color like this, you might not figure out what it says. So a lot of us are thinking about disabilities as being in a wheelchair, being fully blind, being fully hearing impaired, or having some sort of cognitive disability that makes you not function. But a disability is really a mismatch between your body and the state you are in right now and your surroundings right now. In the United States, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, and I think we pretty much have something like this in most countries around the world. It's 26 years ago in the United States that we passed it, 26 years and like 3 weeks. And I have hugely benefited from it, even though I've never been in a wheelchair, because I travel a lot and I drag my suitcase. Fortunately, I've never had one of the things in the middle, and I don't want to. But I know some people are really into that, just not me. So, on the, I know my right from my left, on the left-hand side, yes, the left-hand side, those are permanent disabilities. But anyone here wearing stilettos? You totally should. They make you look hot. No, especially the guys. So everyone has some of those. Everyone maybe has held a baby or had sun glare trying to read their mobile device, right, or their computer, or your headphones have broken. You can all benefit from focusing on this. So, but let's focus more on assistive technology as in a screen reader. When you aren't able to make your code semantic, when you are really creating a widget or an application, and some things people call their websites applications, and it's like, just because it's a single-page website does not mean it's an application. It's just a single-page website because you like JavaScript and don't know how to actually navigate to the next page. I don't have an opinion on anything. I have at least 3 on everything. So there are there's accessible rich internet applications, which are attributes you can add. But there is a rule in ARIA, and there are rules, and the first one is don't use it. Basically, if you can use a native HTML element or attribute with the semantic behavior that you are looking for, use that. So use an input, use a link, and use a button. Don't use a div and call it roll button. One of the neat features about buttons and input types is that they automatically have keyboard focus, and you can tab through them, and other wonderful, wonderful, nifty things. If you are using a div just have divitis, you have to recreate everything in JavaScript, and maybe your React will do that for you. But I am going to write a new framework, and it's going to be called Overreact. And it's going to be an opening and closing script tag. Okay, so frameworks do enable you to create an accessible website, but they don't guarantee the accessibility. I'm talking about most frameworks. I haven't tried all frameworks. I'm sure there's one that came out today. The thing with frameworks is you need to understand the DOM nodes that they're creating. You need to understand basically the markup that it's generating. So you can use frameworks. Like people are using, the issue that I have and the reason that I'm kind of doing this mishmash talk of accessibility and frameworks is people are using frameworks and they don't know the code that they're outputting, and they don't understand, even if they did see it and take a look at it, they don't understand the semantics of what they did versus what they could have done. So another part of this talk is performance. And this is a quote that I found back in March, and it was exactly like this is the summary of my life and argument with everyone, which is, I remember, and I had this discussion with Matthias downstairs, he was blaming his network for a slow loading website. So I remember when 3G was the primary mobile speed. It was slow, but it still worked. So why now when my phone says 3G, it's totally useless and I can't download anything, right? This is what the web looked like in 2010. It was a huge circle and everything was blue. No, it was, the important thing is on the bottom it says 702 kilobytes, right? 702 in November 2010. August 15th, 2016, we are at 2,463 kilobytes. That is an increase of 3.5 times. So our phones have not, people are still using 2G around the world, or even Edge. And I do believe that AT&T, it's called Li-Fi, when your Wi-Fi lies and tells you that when your phone lies. So if you note the darkest area is images or media. So it looks like we've gone down percentage-wise, but what really have done is we've increased the media by huge amounts, because this is actually video right here. So you put those two together and you get the same number. But if you look here, the JavaScript has increased, not 3.5-fold, but 4-fold. Now the thing with JavaScript is when you load it, right, or when you want to run it, and when you put it on a mobile device or any device, you have to make the request, it has to come, you have to download it, you have to parse it, and you have to execute it, and basically everything's on hold until that is done. So this is basically a Mobile Matters picture, and the reason I put it in here is, I don't remember, but mostly it's to remind you that battery is important on a mobile device. It's not just the latency, and that's usually what people talk about when they talk about mobile performance. They're talking about latency. Latency, you get the stuff eventually on your phone. But once it's on the phone, it has to be parsed and executed, which drains the battery, and then you keep making your little AJAX requests to see if this used to happen, it doesn't happen anymore. Facebook used to check to see if you had any new friends every second. This was many years ago. Stoyan took care of it 3-4 years ago. But can you imagine waking up the radio to your mobile device every second and waiting for a response every second and then executing all that JavaScript? That was a huge drain. And also you have limited memory on these devices. We're using the latest and greatest, but 3/4 of the world, if not more, of the mobile devices are on crappy devices with less than 512 or less of RAM and just a few gigs of storage. And mobile phones are going to be increasing. We're expecting to see 4 billion more phones in the next 10 years, and they're all going to be in developing countries, or most of them are going to be in developing countries where that is it's even worse of a scenario. So Alex Russell basically said, because there was this whole Twitter stream 2 days ago, or now 3 days ago, basically about my talk, but they didn't know that I was giving this talk. Or maybe they did, and that's why they were like, this is so interesting. But what they wrote is, do your frameworks and tools cause your app to load in more than 5 seconds on a 3G connection on real hardware? And by real hardware, they mean don't test it on your emulator. Test on real hardware. If yes, you cannot afford them. They're basically saying, if your frameworks are causing so much bloat that it's taking 5 seconds for your site to load, do something about that. So my concern is that we're doing RDD, which stands for resume-driven development. So I'm just going to go a little bit forward. What I want to spark what I want to do today is spark your brain into thinking outside the box. And instead of doing resume-driven development, going, wow, I want to create web components, think about why you want to create a web component. And what is this component actually doing? And do I need to pull in a framework to create one component? So I was working on this site at Visa, and I have no code committed to this project, so don't blame me for any of it, because I left. Because they have 55,000 lines of JavaScript. Now, what does this site do? It accepts an email address, a password, and an input. It has a link, create account, up in the corner. It looks like a button, but it's a link, and a new user's text, and then it has a sign-in button. So it's a form with 3 entries and 1 button, but it is an application because it is a single-page app, because we had to create an app because we were doing RDD, and we had 41 dependencies. 41 dependencies for this. It's like a 4-page form, but I'll show you another page later on. So this is the web page test for this site. And it's not the slowest site in the world. It takes 8 seconds to load, but you might have noticed there were no images, so it doesn't have like that 75% of let's have images. It has 1 repeated background image, and the Visa logo is an image, and there's a little icon. So it has, really small amount of images. But it has 55,000 lines of JavaScript, and it has a DOM content loaded that takes 400 milliseconds. And it thrashes this. Ooh, stop moving on me. It's not going to work. Okay, you behave. Slide's not behaving. Look at that CPU. It is basically like the main thread is being occupied for 8 seconds. So even though document content loaded is at 3 seconds, you still have 5 seconds where you can't use the main thread. So what did I do about this? I recreated the site. So they have 14 engineers working over 1.5 years on that project. Does this look approximately the same? It's a form. It has labels that move. It has this little widget that comes up. That's 1,000 lines of HTML, 1,000 lines of CSS, and under 1,000 lines of JavaScript. So how did I do that? I thought a little bit about outside the box. I'm going to show you another part of this, which is part of the 1,000 lines. It has a carousel. So yes, I coded a carousel and everything else to make this entire app work in under 1,000 lines. So let's go over, just to show off, 0.8 seconds on GitHub. And if you can't read that, let's look at the comparison. So this is the 2 overlaid. So it goes all the way out to here for Visa. And then if you just look at mine, isn't that nice? Okay, so to be fair, my form doesn't do everything their form does, because it doesn't have a back end. But interacting with the back end is not 54,000 lines of JavaScript. Okay, so show you the 3 features. There was one feature I didn't show you, but I'll show you here. So originally, they imported jQuery for 2 purposes. One was cookies. Who here has written a cookie function? And raise your hand. And then fold over the fingers so I can only see the number of fingers as to how many lines that cookie function was. Set cookie, get cookie, right? So they did it for a cookie function, and so they could import this plugin called jQuery Input Mask Bundle.js. Now, if you need jQuery anyway, why not import this? Well, it's slow and it's not accessible, but I understand importing this. It makes life easier if you already need jQuery. But don't pull in a framework just so you can pull in a plugin. Let me show you what it does. Demo. So if we have a phone number, I enter here and I just use the number 4 over and over and over again, or other numbers. And that was the mask. You notice it stayed there. And notice how it moves, because it's not, and notice how it's black. And it's also not accessible, because if you actually went to go to the screen reader here, it would say 44 underscore 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 underscore, I think, depends what screen reader. So what I did is I recreated this in originally 2 kilobytes. It's now to 3 because I added some features to it. So it's at 3 kilobytes, and it does pretty much the same thing. So if I type in 666, because I'm the number of the devil, and it can do stuff like, here's a Canadian zip code. If I type in 5, it doesn't actually allow me to, because it requires a letter number, right? So it does the validation. It does everything in originally 125, now 250 lines of JavaScript. So how did I do this? Oh, and just to show you that it's actually stylable, because that's kind of cool, right? So the mask is stylable, and the other thing is the X's stay where they're supposed to. So it continues to mask and it looks better, and it's more performant. So how did I do this? I thought a little bit outside the box, and so what I require of the developer is to enter pure semantic HTML5. What happens in this case is, if the JavaScript fails to load, and we all know until it has downloaded, parsed, and executed, you are JavaScript free, that works. Someone could start entering the data right there. It's not like the value is being maintained state in React, and this is an inaccessible form. And it's not like I had to wait for everything to get downloaded. Does everyone understand the code there? There's too many people for me to say no, yes, and no if everyone said. So basically, I have a title, I have a pattern attribute, and I have a placeholder, and a class of masked. The class of masked is what tells the browser to please mask me, and this is what the JavaScript does. It takes a span and puts it around the input type, and then before the input type, it creates another span with an ID, and inside that ID, I place an empty I element and a placeholder. And as the user enters 1, 2, 3 on key up, basically, the I gets filled in, and the X's get removed. It matches the pattern, so every time it checks, does it match the pattern? So I don't have to put my patterns in my JavaScript. I don't have to create an input, like a JavaScript validation. I don't have to put my pattern in the JavaScript. I put it right there in the HTML, which is a normal HTML attribute. And if you do get attribute in IE5, which you guys don't even know what that browser is if you're lucky, it still works. The function doesn't work itself in IE8 because I did query selector all, but there is a version that goes with jQuery if you want to, if you have stuff to support IE8. So what I do is I take that span, that 1, 2, 3, XX, I hide the 1, 2, 3 with visibility hidden, opacity 0, or color transparent. One of the three, you don't need all three. So that it takes the original space. So as you enter 1, 2, 3, it looks like this. 1, 2, 3 within the I, which is transparent, and the XX is still there. It's fairly simple. In fact, this is the function. That's the one that creates it, and then there's one that on key up. The CSS is pretty basic. I told you already the transparent, opacity, or hidden. This is an argument I'm still having, so I haven't decided yet. Here is to hide the placeholder if you want to keep the placeholder in place. Notice here that the title is 5-digit zip code, and I added an ARIA label of zip code, 5-digit zip code. I took the label and the title and put them together so that they're red. Because accessibility is important, but it has a label, so I didn't even need that. But if you do have the pattern attribute, you do need to include the title attribute, because you're not only dealing with people with assistive technologies, you're dealing with idiots like myself who can't remember what was supposed to go in here, and there it says 5-digit zip code, so it tells me. So sighted users can use the title attribute, so it's not just for assistive technologies. Okay, so where were we? So a little bit about accessibility and input controls. Use a label. That's the simplest thing. It fulfills the first rule of ARIA. If you want to be fancier, you can use ARIA label, like I did on that thing, and I'm going to take it out, I think, because I haven't decided on it yet, but that will be read by the screen reader. Or you could do ARIA labeled by, and that one is actually read first. So ARIA labeled by allows you to put more than one label. So you could say the ID of the label and the ID of a hint or something like that. If you don't have an ARIA labeled by pointing to elements that have IDs that match, it will read the ARIA label. You should just be putting in a label and not worrying about ARIA, right? If you forgot the label, you need to go into HTML rehab. But it will at least read the placeholder attribute. If you don't have the placeholder attribute, it will actually read that title attribute. And if you don't have any of those, you need to change jobs because your site is not accessible. And that is a very, very bad thing. Okay, so I don't know why I put this back in here. So if you want to see a failed example of this in production, Visa did actually use my code. but they decided to refactor it into their own component, and they didn't know what they were producing, so their React component does not maintain state with the value, and nor does it validate. So I don't actually know how they managed to break it, but kudos to them. So here is that carousel that I created. If I tab into it, I am not a designer. I don't know if you could tell from the rest of my slides or from this carousel, but I am not a designer. But this is actually pretty much their design. I put a little square so you can see which one was highlighted, and it's also dark. I'm hitting the right arrow. I'm hitting the left arrow. I'm hitting the up arrow. I'm hitting the down arrow. This is 3 lines of JavaScript. And I didn't have to, because I didn't have to control the keys, like the keypad, because this is by default accessible because they're radio buttons that are styled, right? I also added these, but if I tab in, I land on the inputs, on those little controls. So if you have a keyboard user, they're going to land on those controls. They're not going to land on the right and left arrow. Now, there's a very specific reason why I chose to do it that way. Keyboard users only need one way to navigate, and they're perfectly happy going right and left because that is the best way to actually navigate. So the right and left arrows are for sighted users who like to use their mouse and don't want to touch a tiny little thing that's hard to reach. But they're not as reachable by keyboard or by assistive technology because I didn't want the screen reader to read them, because if the screen reader read them, right, and saw them, if something has keyboard focus, it has to be accessible to the screen reader. So if I did this, then I would have to tell the screen reader that the page has been updated. In fact, the page hasn't been updated. I've just changed the look a little bit. The content's still there. What it actually is, well, first let me show you what the code that, when Visa implemented it, this is what it looked like. Just for 2 entries. And it's not too, well, it's kind of horrible, because it's actually long. But they did things like, my mouse is acting really weird today. Right here, image, class, null element for accessibility compliance. And I'm kind of like, you just put an image for accessibility compliance. Can anyone tell me what's missing? Alt attribute. And this is for accessibility compliance, so I'm just kind of like, blow my mind. But then they did things like div role option, tab index 0, aria selected equals true, aria label, even though there's content inside, so they don't need the aria label because they were going to read the whole thing anyways, and the aria label, I don't get what they did. Okay, so my version uses a field set with a legend, and the screen reader is going to read that legend. And the legend is going to say, select an address to edit. And then this is a label, and here's another label for the second address, and then I have 2 inputs. So in one of the screen readers, it actually reads the label, it goes through the whole list twice. But that is way more, like, people using assistive technologies, they're used to people, like, things reading stuff in a really weird way. And the people I tested this on said that that was a better experience than normal carousels. So basically, it's an unordered list of radio buttons, same named radio buttons, therefore the keyboard works. And what's the JavaScript? The JavaScript that I use is up in the corner, and it is a function that on radio button changes the parent class, and that's it. It's an unordered list that moves this way. And that's all it is. So it's not a carousel. Or is it a carousel? So carousel says it has to have this particular structure, functionality, animation, and full content. Yes, the full content is accessible and it's there. Animations are controllable. The functionality works, all the keyboard functionality works, and the structure, sure, I don't know what structure they're expecting. And here's another one just to show that this, works in different ways. That you can click on it too. The thing is, this is not actually a carousel. Now, the reason I could not call it a carousel is because people using assistive technologies, when they hear the word carousel, they're like, oh shit, this is going to break on me. And this doesn't. It's just an unordered list, and they get everything they need, and I'm not refreshing the screen on them. So I called it merry-go-round, and because it's kind of like a carousel. So what was I going to say about merry-go-round? Oh, it's kind of weird to make a GitHub repo for a function that's 3 lines long. But I did. So the last feature I want to show you about thinking outside the box is the select item. So here, there's a flag of the United States right there. If I select Brazil, it goes to Brazil. Brazil selected. If I go to Canada, it goes to Canada. You know, you're selecting. It's a drop-down that is stylable, right? This was the version that they had, which called in jQuery. So I guess they used jQuery for 3 features, not 2. And they did dropkick min. But basically, what they did is they put a whole lot of sections. So they have a section with the role of list box, with a section with the role of option, with a tab index, and an aria selected. Inside that, there was a label, but there's no input control. So I guess it's a label for the option in which it finds itself. My version, slightly smaller and easier to read. Field set, select your country. Inputs with labels right next to them. Hide the radio button off the screen. You can still tab through it completely with, without any JavaScript. So there is a file for this, because there's a function that opens and closes the footer, which I guess would open and close the select. So I did not create a repo for this, because basically there is no JavaScript in it. Here's the footer. This is the whole black thing that opened. There's nothing fancy. I did use Sass, so that's why it might look a little weird to some people. And here is when the footer has a class of open, it has a height of 168 pixels. And when it's closed, it scales down to 100% of the width and 0% of the height, so you can transition it over 200 milliseconds so it opens smoothly, but it's still always on the page. And when it's active, has hover, focus, or is checked with the label right after it, I style it slightly differently, and that's how you got the gray. That's it. Like, there's no repo for this, because I'm like, what am I supposed to repositorize? I don't know what the word is. So if all else fails, there is aria. Like, if this thinking outside the box doesn't work for the feature because you really are creating an application and not a multi-page website that's using JavaScript, there is aria, and this is the spec without any CSS. I don't know why the CSS didn't port in, but it's a good resource. If you ever want to print it out, I hear it's 579 pages. So the point of this is to think about what you're doing, to think outside the box, to think about accessibility, to think about performance, because by dropping out all that JavaScript, my site takes less than a second to load, not 8 seconds where people can't do anything on a form that within 5 seconds people are actually doing something. So, so before trying the shiny, the resume filler, think outside the box and think about, other ways of doing it, using semantics. Because who here now, this is late, who here is a front-end developer, not purely designer, who actually codes? Everyone, right? Okay. This is what a job description looks like to me. This is a good job description. You don't see any frameworks on that, because if you understand your JavaScript fundamentals, you can learn a framework. But if you learn a framework and don't understand the JavaScript fundamentals, you can't be a web developer. So this is what's important. And if you can do this and do this well, then, like the 5 years of React, I'm sure there's a recruiter asking for 5 years of React. It's a 2-year-old library or framework. So, think about what you're doing, because you can learn valid markup, semantics, the attributes. Like, I have a full hour-and-a-half talk just on the attributes of the input element. I think it's interesting. You can buy my book if you want to read it and fall asleep. I don't know what you're, but there is actually, my workshop is online, so if you do, Estelle and Forms, YouTube has it. It's like 4 years old, and it's still completely valid because it hasn't changed at all, except for the browser support. CSS fundamentals, you'll learn that inline is a really stupid idea. Learn the cascade, learn your selectors. If you need a resource, if you don't understand it, I have a little poster online called Specificity. It teaches you selector specificity with fish, sharks, and the BP oil tanker, and plankton. And you can always look up the properties and values, but learn about and understand progressive enhancement, accessibility, performance. We need to know about security. You need to know about user experience and design and be a good communicator, because we all have designers, and some of us have designers that should be making wallpaper and not websites because it's really pretty, but it makes no sense. So you need to be able to communicate and push back and be a debater if you have one of those, because you need to be able to argue your points. You need to be a good writer because you need to produce documentation so the person following you. So these are we basically need to be Janes of all trades. Some people would say Jacks, but my name could not be Jack. It could be. Jacques. That could work. So, I'm not putting down front end of, I'm not saying don't use frameworks, but realize that if you have this skill set, use it, because that's really powerful. And that's my argument for today. Does anyone have any questions? I promised Max I would do this.
How many different ways can you drink from the Doppel water bottle? Questions, anyone? Lots of movement and questions. I have a question. So when you were looking at your visa example, and you were looking at the loading times of all the resources, one of the things that I noticed that was slightly different between yours and the original was the amount of other scripts that were being called in from other domains in there as well. And I think it's something that a lot of people miss in the performance element of things, is just all of the behavioral trackers that were going on there as well.
So some of them are behavioral trackers, and some of them are just A/B, there's A/B testing and there's overkill. So one thing you don't have is control over your third-party scripts. Does anyone here develop third-party scripts? Okay. There's a really good talk that's a few years old by Kent Brew on things to watch out for third-party scripts, but I also highly recommend watching it if you import third-party scripts, because it kind of tells you what to watch out for. So third-party scripts can be a single point of failure, but in their scenario, there's so much no in there that the little pixel it's not that little pixel that's causing it. But so let's take a look at it. Or do you have a more interesting question that you want to ask after that? Okay. So it's here, yeah. So, yes, I'm an old lady. Okay. So up to number 20, which is the 4-second mark, it's all their scripts. And then they have Google Analytics 3 times. Probably. Oh, no, 4. Yeah, and here's the THM visa 4 times. So you see this break right here? That's because it's basically doing their behaviors. So the issue would have been normally at 7.7 seconds. So yeah, do be careful with third-party scripts. Only use ones that you trust and update, and don't just, and also extensions. Similarly, don't install extensions that you don't know is reputable, because they're tracking everything. So on this browser, I have ad blocker and do not track, but I have another extension, and I will see ads in my incognito window because of one of my extensions. So they're tracking me through that extension. So that has nothing to do with this talk, but just a fair warning.
So you talked a lot about the accessibility side of things and making things work for screen readers as well. And I think a lot of people here maybe aren't so sure about whether it's worth bothering doing things for screen readers. What would you say to that?
So if you looked at my code, the one that I produced, none of it was specifically for screen readers. It was for performance, and it was for semantics, and it was screen reader friendly. So you guys all noticed that I put on my glasses, right? You're all going to be my age one day. Everyone has a type of disability. Your biggest blind user is Google, right? And they use it. So they basically can read. It's basically, one, it's a nice thing to do. Two, it's the law. And three, it's really not that hard. So my 3 examples happen to be accessible, and I'm like, oh, I'm going to do a talk about accessibility because accessibility talks get accepted at conferences. I haven't talked about this anyway. But no, I do actually think accessibility is really important. And I am considered an accessibility expert in the accessibility community, and I don't write any ARIA because I don't need any ARIA, because I can get what I need done through semantic HTML. So I understand what they're going through, and I test it, but I don't do anything special other than test it. And if you're going to test it, I'm going to get so yelled at for this, but the easiest way that I find to test it is I'm going to use VoiceOver. I'm using Chrome, and I'm using VoiceOver. And that's a no-no, because no one who actually needs a screen reader is going to use Chrome with VoiceOver. They're going to use Safari with VoiceOver. It works perfectly well. Chrome works with Chromevox. But I like to develop in Chrome, and I don't like to hear annoying sounds. So here you'll see in this little black box, it will read the page to me. So if I go here and I hit tab, I'm on the close button. I have no clue where I am. I should totally just get out of full screen and go to a different type of website and go here and hit tab. Oh, I didn't show you this. So this is my attempt at so this deck was not accessible, and I made it accessible, and this is going to be the most ridiculous thing you've ever seen, but you can see how easy it is to do a bad, but at least accessible user experience. It says enable screen reader access, and you notice that we never saw it, right? No one ever saw it until I tabbed into it, because only someone tabbing through would see it. And the reason my site is not accessible is because I've controlled the keyboard to go left to right through the deck. So I've basically stolen their key access. But if they enter this and they, right, let me just go to it and hit enter. Oh, I didn't finish this deck. I wrote this deck yesterday. So if you go to an old version of it, it should work. P, inclusive markup. This is the talk I was planning on doing today. There we go. It removes the CSS, and therefore it removes the hijacking of the keys. And it's ugly, but I can actually tab through all the content, and it gets read to me.
Clearly Vine is a little bit ropey.
Oh, it's the Vine breaking it? Okay. So you see it reads it, and I didn't do anything specific to make this accessible, other than remove the CSS, which removed the accessibility. So how am I testing it? I have VoiceOver on in Chrome. That is a no-no in terms of actual testing, but if you keep this open in the bottom corner and listen to the music from a different computer, because you can't listen, if you actually put the headphones in, you're going to hear what they say. It's a good way of catching to see if it's being accessible. And then another trick is, oops, I hit the wrong keys. There's the accessibility toolbar, which you can install or actually get from flags. And you can click on any element, and it will read to you. Let's zoom in here. And it will read to you what it's saying. So there's no ARIA specified, but it's accessible, and it's going to say we all benefit from the ADA. So you don't have to add ARIA if you're actually using semantic HTML for the purpose that you're doing it. You can add features if you want to, but if you just code semantically, you're 90% of the way there. And when someone sues you, you can be like, oh, well, it's 90% of the way there. Let me add these 3 things. But if you think about it when you first start writing your site, it's really easy. If you try retrofitting, good luck to you. Yeah.
Where would you recommend that people go if they want to read more about semantic HTML, the ways to do it? Because it's quite a tricky thing to find information about.
The old HTML books.
Mm-hmm. That's how I learned.
Yeah.
Dan Cederholm, bulletproof CSS, is it? Or HTML CSS? Yeah. A lot of those ones are...
Yeah.
Yeah, you go to the ones where when the web wasn't as reliable cross-browser, and you can get some really good stuff on HTML. Yeah.
Or just like MDN, learn your elements, and just look at the table of contents of MDN. Or the WC3 has... I'm sending someone to the WC3 to read them. Sorry. If you have insomnia, or if you want to learn semantic HTML, it lists all. There are pages that list all the elements, and when it has like the forms, there's actually a grid of all the input types and all the attributes and whether they match and what they do. So, unfortunately, that way you have to go out of your way. But the best way is just looking at like the Paciello Group's website or someone else's website. If you have a specific question, you're going to Google it and find it there anyway. But if you actually want to just learn semantic HTML, pick up an old HTML book. If you know HTML, you'll be able to read it in like an hour. It's not like you'll just be like, wow, I didn't know that. Oh, I didn't know that either. And I never do this. I need to start plugging myself. Inclusive markup. Oh, wait, maybe let me just refresh this page. Or go to this one. Let me go to the end of the deck, because I have information on that at the end of the deck. And that deck is frozen. Oh, I still have this guy open, that's why. Okay. So there's actually 3 more slides. I might as well cover them right now. Get through this. Oh, this was a long deck. Okay, so here are accessibility. There's 2 resources right there. Oh, so people are taking pictures. This is all available at instartlogic.github.io. There's a link to this deck. So all the talks that I've been doing since I've been at Instart are on that page. So either remember the company name, Instart Logic, or my name, Estelle. And in estelle.github.io is all the talks I did before I started working at Instart. But you see this book right here, and this book right here. This is a really easy book. This is more in depth. They both actually go over all the HTML5 elements and their semantics. So they have a chapter on that, and you can get it on Safari online, if you have Safari online.
Fab. There's a question at the back here.
Hi, great talk here.
Oh, okay.
So that was the case with Visa was, maybe it's mean to say fairly easy about accessibility things, but what would you recommend when it comes to popovers and modal boxes and stuff?
So modal box, 1, really read up before you do a modal box. There's a few issues with modal boxes. This is the other way to drink it. Modal boxes, so there is an element called the dialogue that isn't fully supported yet. So until then, we're using modals. But there are really good articles on how to make them accessible. So I would, that's something you need to look up. But if you do need to do it, 1, I would push back, because let me give an interesting side note. My company right now, we have this non-branded thing called Speed Perception, where actually, if you want to go to speedperception.com, that we show 21 sets of videos and you see the videos go. It takes about 5 minutes to take the test, and we're trying to do an open source data set on perceived performance. And when you go to speech perception, you'll get 21 sets of videos, and you say which one you think loaded faster. And what's interesting, what we're going to look at is when the modal pops up, do people think that it loaded slower than it would have had the modal not popped up? Because it's creating jitter. So when we're looking at the videos, people are thinking that, something that's already loaded, obviously because the JavaScript is working, right? People don't think that that's loaded because the modal popped up. So it's actually impacting perceived performance. So please go to, because we want to get 1,000 people to get 100% on the test. And it's a challenge, but there's 5 honeypots in there. So there's 5 ones where we know which one's faster. So if you get those 5 right, then we count your test. And if you get 4 right, then we put you in a second bucket where we might count it. And if you get 3 or less, which is kind of like, you're a robot. Or you're doing this, and I don't know why you're doing this. So there's more than just the accessibility issue. There's the performance issue, so I would push back. But Paciello Group, I think it is, has a very good article on how to do them and how to do them accessibly. Good question. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I think it's time to have a move around, but thank you, Estelle.